What happens when one playful lift at a wedding becomes the quiet start of a lawful ending? Why does a husband's silence feel more terrifying than anger? How does a moment meant to be funny end with public papers in my hand while everyone's watching? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible stories. I'm Isola Crane, and if I'm being honest, I still don't understand how one playful moment turned into the silence that ended my marriage. It happened at a wedding, of all places. A beautiful hall, everyone laughing, champagne in hand. I thought it was harmless when Daniel's friend Tyler lifted me off the ground during a song. People cheered, someone shouted that we looked cute, and for a second, I felt like the fun wife again. Not the boring grown-up with bills and bedtime routines. Daniel's face changed, though. He didn't yell, didn't even frown, just went quiet. I told myself he was overreacting, that he'd get over it once he saw the video was funny. Because yes, someone recorded it. I posted it too. Why not? Everyone else loved it. Likes, comments, hearts. It felt like proof I was still interesting. I didn't know then that Daniel's silence wasn't hurt feelings. It was distance. He started writing notes, setting reminders, saving receipts. I thought it was work stuff. I kept talking while he kept planning. By the time I realized his quiet was the loudest answer I'd ever get, the papers were already printed. I'm not saying I meant to embarrass him. It just happened in the moment, the way things do when everyone's laughing and the music's loud. The wedding had that kind of energy. Lights twinkling, people taking photos, champagne glasses clinking every few seconds. Tyler, one of Daniel's oldest friends, was dancing with the bridesmaids, trying to make everyone laugh. I was at the edge of the dance floor, my heels already off, when he came over and said something about how I never joined in anymore. I laughed and said I was too old for dance floor chaos. He grinned, said, "You're not old, you're just scared to have fun." And before I could even answer, he scooped me up. It wasn't romantic, not really. More like a scene from one of those wedding highlight videos where everyone looks like they're living their best lives. The crowd clapped. Someone shouted my name. Tyler spun me once and I shrieked, partly from surprise, partly from excitement. For that tiny second, I felt light, free. And when he set me down, I saw Daniel standing a few feet away with that polite half-smile, the one that looks supportive but feels like judgment. I thought he was being dramatic. Later, during dinner, I teased him about it. I said, "Come on, you can't tell me it wasn't funny." He said quietly that it wasn't the kind of joke a husband should have to sit through. I rolled my eyes. I told him people loved it, that everyone thought it was sweet and spontaneous. He didn't argue. He just cut his food, slow and careful, like he was thinking too much about it. That silence annoyed me more than if he'd snapped. I told him he could at least try to be less sensitive. He said, "I'm not sensitive. I just don't find being mocked entertaining." I laughed, said, "You're acting like I kissed him." He said, "You didn't need to." When we got home that night, I kicked off my shoes and went straight to my phone. Notifications everywhere. Someone had tagged me in the clip, Tyler spinning me under the string lights, me laughing with my arms in the air. The caption said, "Best wedding energy ever." It already had hundreds of likes. I showed it to Daniel, expecting him to soften when he saw how harmless it looked. He watched the video once, expressionless, then handed me the phone back and said, "Good for you." That tone, the flatness of it, made my stomach twist. I said he could at least appreciate that people thought we were a fun couple. He said, "They're not laughing with us, Isola. They're laughing at me." I told him that was paranoia. I said confidence makes people uncomfortable, especially when it comes from a woman. He didn't reply. He just started stacking the dishes, washing them one by one. When I told him to relax, he said, "I am relaxed. That's the problem, isn't it?" I didn't even know what he meant by that. He went upstairs early, and I sat on the couch scrolling through the comments again. Someone wrote, "She's the life of the party." Another said, "Her husband looks done." I laughed at that, screenshotted it, and sent it to my friend Cassidy. She replied with a dozen laughing emojis. She said Daniel needed to lighten up. That made me feel justified. It wasn't just me who thought he was being ridiculous. When I finally went upstairs, his side of the bed was empty, but the light from the guest room was on. I stood in the hallway for a minute, confused. He never slept there. I knocked lightly and said, "You're not seriously mad about that, are you?" He said from inside, calm as ever, "I'm not mad, just thinking." I laughed again. "You're overthinking, that's what you're doing." He didn't answer, and the light stayed on for hours. The next morning, I woke to the smell of coffee. He'd already left for work. 2 mugs sat on the counter, his washed and turned upside down to dry, mine half full, cold. There was a faint hum from the printer in the guest room. I peeked in, but the machine had stopped. A blank page rested in the tray. Weird. I shrugged it off and checked my phone. The clip had hit 1,000 likes overnight. People were tagging their friends, writing things like relationship goals and wish my man had a sense of humor like hers. By lunch, Tyler had texted, "You broke the internet, superstar." I replied with a laughing emoji and told him he'd started it. He sent back a winky face. I deleted the thread after reading it twice, just in case Daniel saw it and decided to spiral. Not that he ever checked my phone, he wasn't that type. Still, something about his quietness lately made me cautious. That evening, when he got home, I tried to be sweet. I greeted him with a smile, asked about his day. He said it was fine. I showed him a meme that someone made from the video, a cartoon version of Tyler lifting me with sparkles around us. I said, "See? It's trending now." He said, "I'm glad your reputation's thriving." The way he said "you're" instead of "our" stung more than I expected. I told him he was turning this into something it wasn't. He said, "Then explain what it was." I said, "It was fun. You remember fun?" He said nothing, just opened his laptop and started typing. The sound of keys clicking filled the room. It went on long after I'd stopped talking. I asked what he was doing. He said, "Sorting some things." I asked, "Work things?" He said, "Personal." That word made me pause. He was using that calm, factual tone he always used when he'd already decided something. I changed the subject, tried to joke about how he should be proud people thought his wife was attractive. He said, "Pride is different from spectacle." I said, "You're making it sound like I danced on tables." He said, "You might as well have." I went to bed angry that night. I told myself he was acting controlling, that I was allowed to enjoy myself. He wasn't even jealous in a passionate way, just distant. It felt worse than anger. The distance made me feel small. Around midnight, I heard a faint beep from the guest room, then a soft whir, like the printer again. I considered checking but decided I didn't care. Let him print whatever he wanted. I had nothing to hide, except maybe the messages I'd already deleted. When I woke up again, sunlight spilled across the floor. His side of the bed was untouched. The house was too quiet. On the counter sat the same 2 mugs, same arrangement, his clean, mine unfinished. A calendar reminder flashed briefly on his phone screen before it dimmed again. Downtown 9:40 a.m. I assumed it was a work meeting. Still, something about it, so specific, so tidy, stuck with me as I sipped my cold coffee. I told myself he'd get over it. Men always do, especially quiet ones. You just have to wait them out. But that morning, as I posted one last story from the wedding, me laughing in slow motion while Tyler lifted me under the lights, I couldn't shake the image of Daniel's calm face in the background, still, steady, watching, like someone already planning the end before the party was even over. I double-tapped my own post anyway. The little heart appeared, red and bright. It looked like approval. It looked like control. and I told myself one last time that everything was fine. I didn't mean for the video to blow up the way it did. One of the bridesmaids posted it to a wedding compilation account, and within 2 days, it had thousands of comments. Half the people said it was cute. The other half called it disrespectful. I didn't care which side was right because my name was everywhere. For once, I wasn't invisible. At work, my co-workers teased me about being famous. My boss showed me the clip in a meeting and said, "Guess we've got a celebrity in the office." I laughed like it was no big deal, but deep down, I liked the attention. It made me feel alive. When I got home that evening, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open. The same blank expression, the same half-drunk cup of coffee. I told him the video had hit 30,000 views. He said, "Congratulations." No smile, no sarcasm, just that flat tone that made me feel stupid. I told him people online were calling us a fun couple, that they envied our chemistry. He said, "People online don't know us." I asked if he was still upset. He said, "I'm not upset, I'm watching." I laughed and said, "Watching what?" He said, "Everything." That answer sat in my stomach for hours. Later, when I walked past the guest room, I heard the faint click of his mouse. A glow lit up the crack beneath the door. I asked if he was coming to bed. He said, "Soon." I waited half an hour, but he never came. The next morning, there was a new calendar alert on his phone. Downtown 11:20 a.m. At the office, people kept bringing up the video. Tyler commented, under one of the reposts, "Still can't believe you trusted me to catch you." I replied with a laughing emoji before thinking twice. I deleted it a minute later, but not before someone screenshotted it and sent it to the group chat. By lunch, half my team had seen it. I called Cassidy and said Daniel was being dramatic. She said men like that only understand consequences. I told her he didn't even raise his voice. She said that was worse. When I got home, the guest room door was open. The desk looked different, neat, organized, labeled. There were folders stacked in clean rows. One was titled Household. Another said Utilities. I never remembered him being this tidy. I asked why he suddenly cared about organization. He said it helped him think. I joked that maybe he'd finally become an adult. He smiled, just barely, and said, "Maybe I've just learned to prepare." I didn't know what that meant. After dinner, I went to the balcony to call my mother. I told her Daniel was still sulking. She said, "Men always get threatened when a woman shines." I said he was being ridiculous, that he didn't even like weddings anyway. She said, "He doesn't have to like them, just his wife." That line annoyed me, so I changed the subject. When I came back inside, Daniel was watching something on his phone. The screen reflected in his glasses. I asked what it was. He said, "Research." That weekend, he barely spoke. I kept trying to start small talk, asked about groceries, movies, plans, but he'd just nod or answer in one word. On Sunday morning, I noticed something strange. The USB drive that used to sit near the printer was gone, and a new one had appeared with a label on it, Archive A. I thought about asking, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I told myself it was work-related. In the afternoon, Tyler texted again, saying a blog wanted to feature the wedding clip and interview me. I told him to say yes. When Daniel overheard, he looked up from his laptop and asked, "Why do you need to be interviewed?" I said, "Because people like the story." He said, "Whose story?" I said, "Ours." He closed his laptop and said, "That's the problem." I spent the rest of the evening scrolling through the comments again. Some people defended me, saying I was brave and playful. Others called me cruel. I screenshot the nice ones, sent them to Cassidy, and muted the rest. She said I should ride the wave. "Publicity is power," she texted. I typed, "He's barely talking to me." She replied, "Then let him stew. Men hate losing control." I wanted to believe that. Monday morning, Daniel left early again. I checked his side of the closet. It looked thinner, a few shirts missing, his shoes lined up differently. My first thought was that he was planning a business trip. I checked the shared calendar. Nothing. I texted him, "Where are you headed today?" He replied an hour later, "Out." I asked, "Work or personal?" He didn't answer. At lunch, I showed the video to 2 new interns who hadn't seen it yet. They laughed and said, "You've got guts." It made me feel good until one of them whispered, "Your husband must be patient." I smiled like it didn't bother me, but it did. When I came home, Daniel was sitting on the couch, typing something on his phone. I told him about the blog interview. He said, "Make sure they spell your name right." I said, "You could at least act supportive." He said, "You could at least act married." I told him that was uncalled for. He said, "So was the video." I said, "It's just the internet." He said, "The internet doesn't forget." His tone was so calm it made me angry. I accused him of trying to control me. He said, "No, I'm just recording what's already public." Then he got up, washed his cup, and left the room. I stared at the clean mug in the sink and hated how quiet he made everything feel. That night, when he went to shower, I checked his desk drawer. Inside were printed pages, our bills, emails, even screenshots of my posts. My heart jumped. Why would he print those? I put everything back exactly where it was. When he came out, he noticed I was pale and asked if I was okay. I said, "Just tired." He said, "Then rest. You'll need it." Over the next few days, the house started to feel like a waiting room. He moved slower, spoke softer. Everything he did seemed measured. He'd make 2 cups of coffee, leave mine half full, rinse his clean. One evening, I caught him standing at the sink staring out the window, hands resting on the counter like he was bracing for something. I asked what he was thinking about. He said, "Patterns." I said, "That's vague." He said, "So are you." On Friday, my mother came over. She brought dinner, said she wanted to lighten the mood. Daniel joined us for a while, polite as ever. She tried to joke about the wedding clip, saying, "At least it proves she's still fun." Daniel smiled faintly and said, "Fun can be expensive." My mother laughed nervously and asked what that meant. He said, "We'll find out soon enough." She didn't come over again after that. When I went upstairs that night, his laptop was open on the bed. The screen displayed a cloud storage page. Dozens of folders labeled with dates. Some had titles like Event 1 and Public Record. I clicked one and saw screenshots of my social media, organized by week. Before I could scroll further, I heard him coming up the stairs. I shut the lid fast. He stepped into the room, eyes on me. "Looking for something?" he asked. I said, "No, just checking my emails." He looked at the laptop, then at me and said, "Right." I barely slept. Every little sound, the creak of the floor, the hum of the printer, made my heart race. I kept telling myself I hadn't done anything wrong. It was just a dance, just a lift, just a joke. But his silence had started to feel heavier than any argument. It pressed down on everything. By morning, he was gone again. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and toner. I opened my phone and saw a new comment on the video. He's plotting his escape, and she's too busy smiling for likes. I deleted it immediately, but it lingered in my head all day. When I looked out the window, Daniel's car was already halfway down the street. I told myself he'd cool off eventually. They always do. I just needed to keep the story alive until he remembered how lucky he was to have someone everyone else admired. I didn't know that every like I counted was another piece of evidence he quietly filed away. By the time Monday rolled around again, everyone at work had seen the interview. The article called me the fearless woman who made weddings fun again. I printed it and stuck it on my cubicle wall. The headline looked bold, and I liked seeing my name in big letters. When I showed it to my coworkers, they laughed and said, "Your husband must be a saint." I smiled, even though the word saint didn't feel like a compliment. That night, Daniel came home late. I had set the table with takeout because I knew he wouldn't eat if I didn't. When he walked in, he looked tired but steady, the same quiet that made me want to break something. I told him about the interview and said, "They called me fearless." He said, "You've always been fearless with other people's feelings." I snapped that he was being cruel. He said, "Honest." I said, "You wouldn't know honesty if it hit you." He said, "You'd film it first." I threw my napkin down and went upstairs. The fight should have exploded, but he never followed. The silence after that kind of argument is the worst, like screaming into water and hearing nothing back. I checked his side of the closet again. More empty space. The sight of it made my chest ache, but I told myself he was bluffing. He wasn't the type to leave. On Tuesday morning, I came downstairs to find a faint smell of printer toner and paper dust in the air. A new folder sat on his desk labeled Archive B. I thought about opening it but couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I left for work early, hoping to see Tyler. When I got to the office, Tyler was leaning against the copier, joking with a few people. He saw me and smiled. "Our star," he said. I laughed and asked if he'd read the article. He said he had, and that I looked radiant. I told him Daniel wasn't exactly celebrating. Tyler said, "He'll come around. Guys like him always do." He put his hand on my shoulder as he said it. It wasn't much, just a touch, but the warmth of it stayed longer than it should have. Later that day, while getting coffee, my boss asked if Daniel was okay with all the attention. I said, "Of course," too quickly. My boss smiled politely, but his eyes said he didn't believe me. That evening, I came home to find Daniel sitting at the dining table with our daughter, Sophie. She was coloring quietly while he checked something on his phone. I kissed her on the head and asked what they were doing. She said, "Daddy's teaching me about lists." I laughed and said, "You mean chores?" Daniel looked up and said, "No, about how to keep track of things." His tone wasn't directed at her. I said, "That sounds boring." He said, "Some things should be." After Sophie went to bed, I tried to start a conversation. I said maybe we should take a weekend trip, get away, reset things. He said, "You want to travel now?" I said, "Why not? We used to." He said, "Used to is the key word." I told him he was holding on to a grudge. He said, "I'm holding on to facts." The next morning, I saw his car still in the driveway, even though he should have been at work. I peeked through the curtains and saw him talking to a man I didn't recognize, older, in a grey suit. They shook hands. Daniel handed him an envelope. I stepped back before they could see me. When he came in, I asked who that was. He said, "A friend helping with something." I asked, "Something what?" He said, "Documentation." At lunch, Cassidy called. She said people online had started arguing about me again. Someone uploaded a slowed-down version of the wedding clip with dramatic music and the caption, "When your wife forgets who she married." It had gone viral on another platform. I tried to laugh, but it didn't come out right. Cassidy said, "Don't read the comments. People are jealous." I said, "Maybe they're right." She said, "Since when do you care?" And hung up. When Daniel got home, I was sitting on the couch scrolling through that video. He asked if I was okay. I said, "You tell me." He looked at the screen, then said, "It's strange how people can see what's in front of them before you do." I said, "Stop talking like a therapist." He said, "I'm not talking. I'm observing." He started spending more time in the guest room after that. The door would close softly every night, followed by the faint hum of the computer and the clicking of keys. I started keeping the TV on just to fill the silence. I'd wake up around midnight to the sound of paper feeding through the printer. Once, I got up to use the bathroom and saw a faint blue light under his door. I almost knocked but didn't. Instead, I went back to bed and told myself it didn't matter. On Friday, Sophie came into our room holding her stuffed bear. She asked, "Why does Daddy sleep in the office?" I said, "He needs quiet to work." She said, "He works all night." I smiled like it was a joke, but my throat felt tight. When she left, I sat on the bed staring at the ceiling until sunrise. That weekend, Daniel offered to take Sophie to his mother's house. I said I'd come too, but he said they were just going to spend time together. "You can rest," he added. I told him I wasn't tired. He said, "You will be." Then he kissed Sophie on the forehead and left. While they were gone, I opened his desk drawers. The folders were all neatly stacked, labeled by month. I found one marked June. Inside were screenshots of my posts, transcripts of comments, timestamps of calls. Each page had notes written in the margins, dates, times, brief descriptions. It didn't look angry, it looked clinical. My chest went cold. When I heard the car pull into the driveway, I shoved everything back and pretended to be reading on the couch. He came in with groceries, calm as ever. He didn't mention the mess I'd probably made in the drawers. He just said, "We're out of milk." I said, "I'll go tomorrow." He said, "No, I already bought some." That night, as we sat in silence, the sound of Sophie's laughter came faintly from her room. He looked toward the hallway and smiled slightly. Then he said, "She asked me today why people online are saying mean things about you." I froze. "What did you tell her?" I asked. He said, "That people see what they're shown." I told him that was cruel. He said, "It's true." I slept badly again. At some point in the night, I heard the faint sound of the printer and a quiet click like a drawer closing. In the morning, a new USB drive was taped beneath the taxes folder on his shelf. It had today's date written on it. I went to work pretending everything was normal, but when Tyler came by my desk and said, "You okay? You look tired," I almost cried. Instead, I told him Daniel and I were fine. He said, "If you ever need a break, I know a few weekend spots by the lake." I smiled and said, "Maybe." When I got home, Daniel was sitting in the living room, typing again. He didn't look up when I entered. I asked if he wanted dinner. He said, "Already ate." I said, "Where?" He said, "Out." I wanted to ask who with, but I was afraid of what calm answer he'd give. The house felt smaller that night. Every little sound echoed: the printer, the phone buzz, the squeak of a chair. All of it sounded like proof of something I hadn't yet understood. Before bed, I scrolled through my phone, searching for messages that would make me feel admired again. Tyler had texted a selfie from a rooftop bar with the caption, "Wish you were here." I typed back, "You'll survive without me," and deleted it before hitting send. I turned off the light and listened to the faint hum from the guest room, the sound of quiet planning. It had become part of the house now, like breathing I couldn't hear until I stopped pretending it wasn't there. The weekend after that, my mother invited us for dinner. She said it would be good for everyone to reset. Daniel didn't answer when I asked if he was coming, so I told her yes anyway. I spent the afternoon pretending to prepare, brushing Sophie's hair, picking a dress that looked effortless. When Daniel finally came downstairs, he was wearing his usual grey shirt and calm expression. I asked if he planned on joining us, or working on his mysterious files. He said, "I'll come." The drive there was silent except for Sophie singing to herself in the back seat. Every so often, Daniel's phone buzzed. He ignored it. I tried to break the quiet by saying my mother was making her famous roast. He said, "She always was better at hosting than listening." I asked what that was supposed to mean. He said, "It means dinner will be loud." When we arrived, my mother greeted us like she was welcoming a camera crew. She hugged me, kissed Sophie, and told Daniel he looked paler than usual. He thanked her politely. She led us to the table already set with candles and dishes, talking non-stop about the latest neighborhood gossip. Halfway through dinner, she brought up the wedding clip. She said it had personality and that she'd shown it to her friends. I laughed and said I was practically famous now. Daniel just looked at his plate. My mother noticed and said, "Oh, don't be embarrassed, Daniel," Everyone knows it was harmless. He smiled faintly and said, if it was harmless, it wouldn't still be a topic. My mother tried to diffuse it with a toast, but the mood shifted. I could feel his silence closing in. Sophie asked why everyone stopped talking. I said, adults are just being boring. Daniel said, some lessons start early. After dinner, my mother pulled me aside while Daniel helped Sophie with her shoes. She whispered, he's holding this against you. Men like that don't move on. I said, he'll have to. She said, or he'll make you pay. I rolled my eyes, but something about her tone made my chest tighten. On the drive home, Daniel asked quietly, do you ever stop performing? I said, do you ever start living? He said, I'm living just fine. I told him his calmness was suffocating. He said, that's not calmness, Isola. That's restraint. When we got home, I poured a glass of wine and sat on the couch scrolling through my phone. Tyler had posted another video from the wedding, a slow-motion version with filters and text that read, still iconic. I watched it twice, liking how I looked, before noticing Daniel standing in the doorway. I said, don't start. He said, I didn't say anything. I said, you don't have to. He turned off the living room light and went upstairs. The next morning, Sophie asked if Daddy was mad. I said, no, just tired. She said, he wrote my name on a list. I asked what list. She said, a big one with words. My heart skipped. I told her maybe it was a grocery list. She frowned and said, it had dates. Later that day, I noticed his phone lying on the counter. I glanced at the screen. A message preview read, follow-up confirmed, documents ready by Friday. I dropped the phone when I heard his footsteps. He picked it up calmly and said, something wrong? I said, just checking the time. He looked at me for a long second before putting the phone in his pocket. That evening, my brother Sam called. He asked if everything was okay. I said, why wouldn't it be? He said, Daniel texted me about some joint accounts. Said you'd be informed soon. My pulse quickened. I laughed and said Daniel must be overcomplicating things again. Sam said, he sounded serious. I confronted Daniel when he got home. Why are you talking to my brother about our finances? He said, transparency. I said, you're not the only one who knows big words. He said, no, but I'm the only one using them. I accused him of trying to embarrass me. He said, you already did that for both of us. That night, I dreamed of paper fluttering across the floor, white and endless, while Daniel stood in the doorway watching. When I woke, the sound of the printer filled the house again. I walked into the hall and whispered, what are you printing at 4 in the morning? No answer. The following afternoon, Marla, his mother, called me. She asked if we could talk in person. Her tone was cold. I met her at a cafe near the park. She ordered tea, didn't touch it. I don't want to get in the middle, she said, but Daniel's preparing something serious. I don't think you understand how far this has gone. I said, he's being dramatic. She said, no, he's being deliberate. I told her she always took his side. She said, he's earned that. When I came home, Daniel was in the kitchen making Sophie a sandwich. I said, your mother's spreading rumors. He said, she tells the truth more kindly than you do. I said, you're both exhausting. He said, we agree on that at least. For days, the air in the house felt heavy. He still made coffee every morning. 2 mugs, 1 untouched. I still checked my phone for comments I pretended not to care about. Tyler texted again, saying he missed my chaotic energy. I typed, you'd be bored of it in a week, and hit send before I could stop myself. He sent a winking emoji. I deleted the thread, but guilt crept in anyway. Friday night, Daniel came home late. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, calm as ever. I asked if he was seeing someone. He said, no, I'm seeing things clearly. I said, you're cruel. He said, no, just awake. Saturday morning, he took Sophie to the park. I used the quiet to search his drawers again. Inside one, under the labeled folders, I found a small envelope. It contained photos, screenshots of my messages, printouts of my social posts, a few bank statements. Each one was marked with a date. My hand shook. I shoved everything back and slammed the drawer. When they returned, Sophie ran to her room. Daniel set a grocery bag on the counter and said, "We're out of detergent again." I said, "That's what happens when you keep washing the same things over and over." He looked at me, expression unreadable, and said, "Some stains don't fade." That night, the tension reached a quiet breaking point. I told him I was tired of living like roommates. He said, "Then stop performing for the walls." I told him he'd pushed me away first. He said, "You did that the night you needed an audience." I shouted that he was punishing me for having a life. He said, "You call that a life?" I didn't answer. I just went to bed and listened to the faint sound of him moving things in the guest room. Drawers opening, paper shifting, keys clicking. Somewhere between anger and fear, I realized he wasn't just collecting proof anymore. He was building a case. The next morning, his car was gone. A note on the counter read, "Taking Sophie to Mom's. Don't wait up." The coffee machine was still warm. A second later, my phone buzzed, a tag notification from Tyler. He'd posted a throwback photo of us at the wedding, captioned, "Still the best night." I stared at the screen until it blurred. The house was too quiet, too clean, like someone had already packed up their side of the story and left the rest for me to explain. When Daniel and Sophie came home late Sunday afternoon, the air felt colder, even though the windows were closed. I asked if they'd eaten. He said yes. I asked where. He said, "Mom's." I said, "You could have told me." He said, "You were busy." I didn't like the way he said it, calm and final, like he knew exactly what I'd been doing. I had spent the morning trying to distract myself, cleaning, pretending to work, scrolling through comments I told myself didn't matter. The post Tyler had made of us at the wedding was still climbing in views. People wrote things like, "She's glowing," "Her husband's lucky," and others wrote, "That man's silence says everything." I wanted to reply, to explain that they didn't understand us, but I couldn't decide which version of us was even true anymore. That night, I asked Daniel if he wanted to talk. He said, "About what?" I said, "About whatever you've been planning." He said, "Planning takes patience. You don't have that." I told him patience was just cowardice in disguise. He said, "Then I guess I'm the coward who finally learned to listen." I laughed, but it came out shaky. When I went to bed, he stayed downstairs. I could hear faint tapping from his keyboard. Every sound felt like evidence being written, every silence like another wall going up. Around midnight, I gave up pretending to sleep and went down for water. He was at the table surrounded by folders, his face lit by the glow of his screen. I said, "You look insane, you know that?" He said, "Insanity is repeating mistakes and expecting applause." I told him he wasn't funny. He said, "Good. I'm done being your joke." The next morning, his car was gone before sunrise. Sophie's backpack sat by the door, already packed. She said Daddy was taking her to school early. I nodded, confused. He'd never done drop-off before. When I opened the fridge, I saw a note stuck to the milk carton. "Don't forget the parent-teacher meeting." 3U. The handwriting was precise. He'd never left notes before either. At work, I couldn't focus. I kept checking my phone. There were no texts from him, no updates. Around noon, Cassidy sent me a screenshot from a gossip forum. Someone had posted, "The husband finally unfollowed her." Maybe he's done being a prop. I stared at it for a full minute before replying, "People are vultures." Cassidy said, "Maybe he's just embarrassed." I said, "He's being dramatic." She said, "Or smart." When I got home that evening, he was sitting on the couch reading a folder. I asked if we were okay. He said, "We're accurate." I said, "That's not an answer." He said, "It's the only one that fits." I told him I couldn't take the riddles anymore. He said, "You never liked direct talk either." I shouted that I was trying. He said, "Now you are." Then he stood, placed the folder on the coffee table, and walked past me. Inside the folder were printed screenshots of my text messages, nothing explicit, but close enough to make my throat close. Tyler's name appeared again and again. My fingers shook as I flipped through them. One of the texts read, "Wish he looked at me the way you did that night." I didn't even remember writing it. I heard Daniel upstairs and slammed the folder shut. When he came down, I said, "You went through my phone?" He said, "No, I went through my memory." I told him he had no right. He said, "You gave the world rights when you posted everything." I spent the next few days alternating between guilt and defiance. I told myself he was overreacting, that he was trying to trap me with my own words. But each night, when I walked past the guest room, I could smell the faint chemical scent of printed paper and ink. It reminded me of being watched even when he wasn't there. One evening, Sophie asked if we were fighting. I said, "Grown-ups just talk differently." She said, "Then why do you whisper all the time?" I froze. I wanted to say something clever, but instead I just hugged her and said, "Because grown-ups get scared too." She looked at me the way Daniel sometimes did, like she saw through everything. Friday morning, I found a new alarm set on Daniel's phone. Paper drop, 9:15. I didn't ask. I didn't want to know. When he came home that night, he looked strangely calm. I said, "You've been busy." He said, "That's one word for it." I asked if we could start fresh, maybe counseling. He said, "You don't go to counseling when the structure's already condemned." I said, "So that's it?" He said, "No, not yet." Saturday, he took Sophie to the park again. I followed a few hours later, pretending it was coincidence. I saw them sitting on a bench feeding ducks, Daniel's arm resting behind her. They looked peaceful, untouched by everything I'd broken. When Sophie ran to the swings, he turned and saw me. I waved weakly. He didn't wave back, just nodded once, like acknowledging a stranger. That evening, I tried one last time. I told him I missed when things were easy. He said, "Things were never easy. You just didn't notice me working to keep them that way." I said, "You're trying to rewrite history." He said, "No, just filing it properly." I laughed in disbelief. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked. He said, "Every word. That's why I'm so quiet." He went upstairs, and I heard the soft click of the guest room lock. I sat on the couch, wineglass in hand, and stared at the folders he'd left on the table. One of them was labeled Household, Interim. The word interim made my stomach twist. I wanted to tear it open, but part of me didn't want to confirm what I already feared. Later, when he finally came out, I was half asleep on the couch. He looked at me for a moment before speaking. "You think this ends with a fight," he said. "It doesn't. It ends with order." I said, "What kind of order?" He said, "The proper kind." Then he walked past me toward the front door. I heard the deadbolt turn, then the soft sound of keys landing on the table. The next morning, his side of the bed was stripped bare. The drawer, where he kept his clothes, was empty except for one folded note. "Handle it properly." I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at those words until the sunlight changed color on the wall. My phone buzzed with a message from Tyler asking if I was okay. I didn't answer. I just stared at the blank space where Daniel's name used to appear every morning. For the rest of the day, I wandered through the house trying to feel angry, but there was only this strange, calm fear. It felt like waiting for a storm that had already passed, only realizing afterward that the quiet wasn't peace, it was aftermath. When evening came, I found his old mug in the sink, rinsed, spotless, set upside down on the counter. Mine sat beside it, still half full and cold. I didn't touch it. I just watched the light fade from the window until the reflection disappeared. I saw him again a week later in the courthouse lobby. He stood near the window, calm as ever, a folder in his hand. When he turned, there were two officials beside him. One asked my name. I said yes before I even understood why. Daniel handed me an envelope. I thought it was some formality, but when I saw the seal and the printed words, petition for divorce and temporary custody orders, my breath caught. People nearby glanced up as papers shifted between us. I whispered, "You're embarrassing me." He said, "You already did that yourself." Then he signed something, thanked the clerk, and walked out without looking back. The glass door closed softly, like the last sound of a marriage disappearing.